Well, today on Rethink Real Estate, we've got Ty Tashiro, and he is going to be talking to us about social awkwardness. Now, we had the pleasure of having Ty at our conference for Harcourts North America not so long ago. And this topic, it was unbelievable to see how much it resonated with the crowd. Now, in order to come to the Harcourts conference, you need to be a top realtor or a business owner. So the very best people within our organization. But it was unbelievable to see that most of the room lean into the vulnerability of that socially awkward perspective. Now, not only from themselves, but also trying to understand how they can read their clients better, how they can obviously have more impact with people that might be a little bit awkward in nature. And today we're going to dive into that a little bit further. And I really enjoy this topic from a vaster understanding of just the human characteristics that we deal with so often in the real estate community. Thanks so much. Welcome to Rethink Real Estate. My name is Ben Brady, and this is a real estate podcast aimed to deliver sales strategies, marketing tips, and business insights from industry experts and myself to build a listing-focused business for the future. Let's get into it. Ty, welcome to Rethink Real Estate.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm so fascinated with the topic that we had the pleasure of seeing you speak at our Harcourts conference that we did not too long ago in Ojai Valley, which was a great venue. But for those that don't know who you are, we've obviously done a little bit of an intro. Why should they stick around and listen to the podcast?
Yeah, so, my background's in psychology, and I've been interested in the psychology of social awkwardness because it turns out to be this really fascinating topic that not only tells us about why some of us are just naturally socially awkward and have these uncomfortable, embarrassing moments, but also tells us some interesting things as well about giftedness. So giftedness is actually strongly correlated with social awkwardness, which is a really kind of fascinating topic to delve into. And I think awkwardness also tells us a lot about how social interactions go well. And so sometimes, like in neuropsychology, for example, when you're teaching that, you'll teach students, so what happens if you have damage to a certain part of the brain or you use a drug and it affects a certain part of the brain, and seeing how it works differently or how it dysfunctions actually tells you something about how it works well. So I think awkwardness is interesting in that way as well. Even if someone's not socially awkward, it actually sheds a really bright light on how we can make our interactions go better.
Well, I think that the first thing that I want to say about all of this is that first and foremost is that you did a wonderful job and we got such great feedback at our conference as a speaker. It really did shed a lot of light on it. And one of the things that I absolutely noticed was the audience resonate with you immediately because of the vulnerability that you put out about yourself, but then about the topic as well. So for those that didn't have a chance to come to our conference and the audience that's listening in now on the podcast is that I think one of the parts that I was super surprised at is that our audience of our people was the top, say, 75 to 100 agents within all of our company. So you have to be invited to our conference. You either have to be a business owner or a broker of a real estate agency, or you have to be a top performer within our company. But then the funny thing is that in the real estate industry or in sales industries in general, people think, because you're in sales, that you're not socially awkward or you don't have any level of awkwardness to you because you're going to be interacting with people on a daily basis or being able to sell something or whatever. But it's amazing that the moment that you open that crowd up of our absolute best performers, I still think you were one of the most about speakers of all of the conference because of the topic itself. So I guess that not only is it a skill set to understand yourself and what you're going through a little bit more. But I think there's another element that got people so curious in the real estate industry is being able to understand their clients. Because the thing that we constantly say is that we see people at their most vulnerable because they're going through change, but maybe that's not the reason. Maybe it is because they're a little awkward, and understanding that a little bit further. So my first sort of direction and question that I want to go down, if you're a person and you're in sales and you know that you're a little bit more introverted, you know that you're a little bit more socially awkward, what are some of the things that you can do in order to help yourself in those situations? Or am I thinking about this wrong?
No, I think you're right on target there, Ben. And thanks for the nice feedback. I got to tell you, I enjoyed that conference so much. It was one of my favorite speaking engagements in years. I just love the energy there. And just real quick, if I may, one of the things I really enjoyed at the awards banquet was just seeing how genuinely happy everyone was for everybody else. I mean, those things can get competitive in a nasty way sometimes. I've been at those kinds of awards banquets, and I just really like the vibe that you had there. And I know that's not an accident. So anyways, I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. And I was surprised, actually, to tell you the truth, how many agents came up afterwards and said, hey, so I'm actually really awkward by nature, but I've found some ways to deal with it and cope with it and actually make it an asset at certain times. So even as someone who thinks about this topic a lot, I was surprised to hear that people spending that much time with other folks and being that social really had the awkwardness kind of at the core. So yeah, if someone is that way, and it usually emerges early. So if you're an awkward person, you felt that way your whole life. In fact, a lot of the research studies on this find that it emerges in infancy or early childhood. So there's certain signals, social signals we can pick up on that really predict well that, hey, this is just going to be an awkward person probably for their life. I think what happens though for people who are really motivated and for people who are humble and insightful about themselves is in elementary school and junior high school, they say, hey, I'm just an awkward person. And they don't necessarily get too down about that, but they just say, I need to work harder on my social skills to get to where everybody else is at. And, I was a really awkward kid growing up. And I felt embarrassed about it sometimes. Like I just didn't know how to handle small talk or what were seemingly routine social interactions. And I remember one day after school in junior high, I ran into one of my buddies. And I said, hey, what's going on? What are you doing? And he kind of blushed. And he said, well, I'm getting some math tutoring. I could tell he was really embarrassed. And I thought to myself, hey, that's great. you know, you're struggling in a subject. That's not your fault, but you're willing to come in and do the extra work, right? And to drill and practice and be persistent to get yourself to where you need to be. And for me, that was a great moment of insight where I said, that's kind of like me in social skills. I need to tutor myself or get tutoring from other people, and I need to work harder than other folks. And so certainly for the agents that I met at the conference, that's obviously what they did. And I think one of the cool things about that is because they have to figure out those social interactions in a very deliberate kind of way, sometimes they overshoot. And so what you find is they've actually developed better social skill in certain situations just because they had to build it from the ground up.
That's such a good point. But it's also the other part of that as well is that there's this other point that I can see dealing with people. You can actually pinpoint the people that are really consciously making an effort not to be socially awkward to the point that they become even more overbearing and awkward. There is this fine line where you overdo it as well.
Yes.
And it's something that then makes other people a little uncomfortable. However, that's not the point of this. Is that what would you say is the difference between somebody like I'm thinking of a couple of people that are friends of mine that would say, and myself included, that would say, I just don't like people. Like I don't like, interacting with people, whatever. That's not that. Is that somebody in denial about them being awkward or, maybe sometimes genuinely they just don't like interacting or going to networking or whatever. I personally really do not like networking. I really don't like it. I find it highly awkward. I find it, I think that there's a part of my ego that doesn't like it either, like being very vulnerable about it, is that I think there's this part of me that just doesn't like interacting with people that I don't have built relationships with. And I don't know whether that's awkward or whether that's just me being an introvert or I'm not sure of the differences.
Yeah. So I think it can be circumstantial. So like you said, maybe you don't like networking things. One of the nice things to know is just because I talk to so many people about awkwardness, that's not unusual. So a lot of people hate networking. And I think that's a broader lesson, I think, about social awkwardness, which is a lot of times it can feel very lonely or like you're some outlier. But in fact, a lot of people feel uncomfortable about a lot of different kinds of social situations, and that's okay. I think that can be normalizing and helpful in that way. I think the other thing you're talking about, though, is sometimes people just have this more generalization where they're like, I don't like people. I don't like hanging out with people, which is a different kind of thing. I do think that is probably defensive because one of the things we know is that even the most awkward person, at the core of it, is just like anybody else, and they have that fundamental need to belong, that fundamental need to have a couple of close friendships that they can rely upon. And if they're having trouble doing that, then you and I could easily see how they might say, "Oh, I don't need that. Or I'm not interested in that." But the sad thing for me about that, especially when it's a young person, is it's like, well, you're not going to get anywhere then, right? If you can't sit there and just sit with this comfort to say, "Gosh, I'm just not good at this. I seem to be failing a lot of this effort to establish these ties," then you're not going to develop the skills and have the openness to make the change that you need to make.
There's so many things that go through my mind with that statement, but I want to get something a little bit more relevant to the audience first of all, because I think there's a lot of people out there at the moment that probably they might not be socially awkward, but dealing with socially awkward people makes them awkward. So if I'm sitting across the table and I'm doing a listing presentation, say, so let's say that I'm sitting there and I've got, I'm talking to somebody about putting their home on the marketplace and I'm pitching myself for that business, but they're not a person like, because I look at, like there's a difference between you being awkward or how you handle an awkward situation. It's usually a pretty awkward situation when you open up the door of a property and you knock on that door. You like there's so many individual moments for awkwardness that I could go through. Like I think about myself when I was in the real estate industry, like knocking on somebody's door and cold prospecting, calling somebody over the phone. That's fine. They're designed to be awkward, and the way that you handle those situations, that's great. But then when you're going in and you're doing business face to face with somebody, you walk into their home, they're showing you through the property. It's a situation where you don't know them very well whatsoever. There's these awkward moments of silence. You feel as a real estate agent that you need to fill in the gap by saying something about their home at every single point, or maybe that's a me thing. Okay. Then you sit down with them and you sit down with them at their dining room table and you're having a conversation with them, or you can tell they might be distracted or they don't have eye contact with you, and all these different parts of it. So my question to you is, what is the best thing to do when you're dealing with somebody that clearly is awkward from an interaction standpoint?
Yeah. So, some of what you were talking about is just like, there's just some natural awkwardness, it sounds like, with that. Like, so an awkward moment, I should say, the definition of that is it's a violation of a relatively minor social expectation. And so, like, if we think about normal social interaction, there's a scaling up of intimacy, for example, like how well you know the person.
100%.
Well, being in someone's home right off the bat, I mean, you're getting into their life at an accelerated rate, so that can feel uncomfortable. It's not what's expected, right? And so for those things, I would just say, just as a generalization, that's okay, and it's probably a little bit uncomfortable for everybody. But if it's that the client themselves are just dispositionally awkward, that's just kind of the way they are. I have a few tips maybe I can give folks. One thing is that the awkward person, they'll just do things that don't really make sense, that aren't expected, and then we feel that visceral discomfort, right? And it's elevated, so it's stronger than it needs to be. It tells you just how wired our brains are to be attentive to social interaction and to be sure that an interaction is going smoothly and that we're cooperating with one another. So because our brains wire that way, the emotional reaction we have when something even small is off a little bit, it's just accentuated beyond what it needs to be. So people can take that into account and think like, you know what, this discomfort I'm feeling is probably 2 or 3 times what it actually needs to be for the situation. I think the second thing would be, just have some patience with it. So a lot of times the awkward person will get to where you need them to be, but they're just confused about how to get there. So they might be having a hard time getting across the point they want to get across to you, the meaning or the underlying intention. It's actually one of the primary symptoms of awkward people. They have this idea in their head of what they want to say, but they just have a hard time getting that into words so that other people can understand that clearly. If you just give them time and you're patient with it, a lot of times they'll get to where they need to be. I think one of the most important things, though, is while you're being patient, is to manage your emotions. So one of the things we know from brain imaging studies is that socially awkward people, when they're in a one-on-one interaction like that, their brain is on fire. So they are really hyped up and they can't help it. It's just the way they are. And so something like eye contact, for example, when awkward people look other folks in the eye for 3.1 seconds, which is the average amount of time, uh, they are just overwhelmed neurologically with that. It's kind of like looking into the sun for too long. And so one of the things that they'll reflexively do, that they've actually probably done since childhood, is they'll look at your chin or they'll look at the corner of your ear. Now, if you're on the receiving end of that, it just feels uncomfortable, right? Because you're like, what are they looking at? Or why are they
Yeah.
looking at my chin? Well, the reason they do that is because it's like averting their eyes from the sun. So it takes down the emotional intensity of the situation if they're not looking in your eyes. And so what they're trying to do is they're actually trying to listen to what it is you're saying. They're trying to focus on the interaction, but to do that, they have to look somewhere else than more is expected. But if you're on the receiving end of that, right, you're like, oh, are they disinterested? Are they mad at me? Right? All these things run through your head. And what I'd say to an agent who's not socially awkward is I'd just say, just let it go. Just be like, that's just them, one of their awkward quirks. God bless them. And it's nothing necessarily about me.
Right. So there's a part of this that you said when we were leading into this statement that I'm very curious about. And again, we're going to get off the topic of real estate, and we're going to and this is just something I'm curious about in general, because it probably does lead back into something that it's more advice for me. Like, I'm in an awkward position, I believe, because I'm the CEO of a company, and in order to grow it, is that networking is a pretty big part of it. I despise it. I don't like it. So I often feel like it's just like anything, like working out, like anything. You've got time under tension will make you better at it. There's no question that that'll be the case. Is that you build up this callus, so to speak, to it, that then ultimately you get better at it and it becomes more comfortable. Now, that said, though, is that I see this younger generation of people coming through, whether it be kids that are being brought up by parents, whether it be, I heard this statement the other day that, it was, again, it could be completely false, but a third of kids with iPads will display, signs of ADHD, and you take the iPad away, and within 3 months that they will return back to normal. Like, there's this part of it that is really interesting to see where the world will go, so to speak. And sorry to get philosophical, but if you've got a kid and they're at a younger age, and they are clearly socially awkward, they don't want to interact with friends, they are clearly an introvert, so to speak.
Mm.
What would the advice be if you're maybe a teenager, maybe a younger person, maybe have younger kids, and you can see it going that way? What would be your advice to somebody, even an adult like me, to get more comfortable in those awkward situations?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, because I think you're seeing a lot of it, to be philosophical about it, right? Just at a societal level, you're just seeing a lot of discomfort socially among young people, and it's not. I don't think it's their fault necessarily.
Mm.
Now, they do have responsibility, but it's not necessarily their fault. The pandemic was a huge thing with this, and for context, for folks who maybe didn't have kids around the house or whatever, and it's been interesting for me to be at universities or colleges speaking, and to hear people's stories about, hey, so my junior year, like, I just lost my social life. And then, their freshman year of college was weird and not normal. And, now they're trying to put the pieces back together and pick up these developmental parts that they just missed out on. So I think for parents or for mentors in general, I would always say, just start with a place of understanding, start with a place of empathy, which I think goes for just about anything, but especially I think in this case, because we can leap to, oh, they need to try harder, or, oh, they're not making an effort. But I think just to pump the brakes and say, hey, I know this is vulnerable, and this is kind of a personal thing, but can you just tell me what your hesitation is or what your worries are when you go into some of these social interactions, or when you think about going into these social interactions? And just to be non-judgmental about it. I mean, I think that takes you more than half the way there, actually,
Right.
because that's such a relief, right? Even for probably you and me, if we can be honest like that, and just to have someone say, hey, okay, that's all right, but let me support you then in how we can move that forward. And for young people, especially, I think right now, just going backwards a little bit, almost remedial, like, and to say, hey, let's just one piece at a time for this month. Can we try calling two friends? Why they don't call? Can we try texting or messaging two friends and seeing if you actually want to get face to face and hang out? And that's a pretty monumental thing if they haven't been doing that, but that would be a good place to start out. So
Yeah, that's awesome advice. That is awesome advice. Like if you take that little bit of advice and you apply it to people that are in real estate, people that are in an outbound sales role, people that are, that even down to kids that, just text your friend and see if you want to, go hang out at the basketball court or something along those lines, to just incrementally make those little steps to get people to reach out to others. Like it's like one of those comments that I remember my mum saying all the time. Mum, I'm bored. Like growing up, she's like, well, call somebody, call your friend, do
yeah.
that. And then you think about that, like I don't know whether or not that happens much anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, we actually have data on that, and it's not happening as much anymore. And even dating, which people are, pretty motivated to do when they're teenagers, that's happening a lot less. And so, yeah, and then there's all the mental health struggles that teens and young people are having with depression, anxiety, and so forth. And if you just backtrack it, I think you can look at, well, the social life is not as good. And once again, there's been circumstances around that have made it really tough for them. So yeah, I think having some empathy and then just dosing the support and the encouragement, and even for us as adults, like I can't stand networking either. But if you probably have to go, Ben, the full time. But if it was a younger person, for example, in the company, and you were their manager, you could just say, hey, just go for half an hour, and then you can slide out after that. Next time, let's try 45 minutes. And just kind of build it up like that. I think that just helps people to know, like, hey, anytime there's social anxiety, if you say, here is the out, almost like a undercover agent saying, there's the door out of this dangerous situation, it really actually gives people a lot of courage to tackle the situation.
It's a strong point that sort of has gotten me thinking about that. That one comment, it gets me thinking about my leadership style and how I can help people that clearly, at the end of the day, some of the time you don't hire the person that is a socially awkward person because it's like, I don't want them around the office or I don't want to interact with them, but they might be really good for the role. They might be the right fit for the role if you can take that on and you can help them a little bit more. But the one thing I would go to first before I dive into the leadership style is that I think as a leader, when you've got people within your company that can go and do those more awkward things, I tend to push. Again, I've got to, and the people that listen to this religiously, or they know the company. Josh Prokopis is my COO, and Josh is phenomenal in a social situation. I send him to everything because I don't want to go. I don't want to go, Ty. And it's not because I don't see the value in me going at all. That would be an excuse that I would use in a public forum to go, oh, that wasn't valuable for me to go to. It's just because I don't want to go to networking functions because it makes me feel anxiety. It makes me feel awkward. It makes me feel all those things. Mm-hmm. Whereas Josh is great in those moments. So as a leader, I think it's hurt me being at the top position because I can send others to do it. Now, don't get me wrong, like there's an element of this that we need to help other people, nurture the awkwardness. But what would you say to the leaders that might be listening to this as well, is that do you have to practice what you preach? Like that's a thing that sort of definitely has popped up here.
Yeah, I guess to a certain extent, but at the same time too, just to play devil's advocate here, I might say your leadership strategy in that case is a real strength that you're saying, because, once again, playing devil's advocate here, just for some fun. If you did all those things that you don't like doing or that you're uncomfortable with, that would drain you, and so maybe to be the strongest leader that you can be, you're doing the wise thing by saying, hey, let's kind of divide and conquer here a bit. And let's have people like Josh, for example, who that's a pretty comfortable thing for them. It's just more natural. It's not going to drain them as much. We could make the argument that's a smart leadership strategy. Now, the other point I think is a valuable one as well. You don't want to always send Josh right to those things. You want to push yourself as well, but I'm sure you're doing that. But I think there's nothing wrong with that. When I'm running teams myself, I'm always looking to hire things that I don't feel comfortable with or that I'm not as good at. And it doesn't mean I'm off the hook, but it does mean that overall as a team we'll be stronger because I'm saying, hey, this person's going to be better actually in this situation than I would be.
So bringing it back to from a leader perspective, maybe when you're hiring somebody, and then if you do hire somebody that obviously needs a little bit of help with the social anxiety or the awkwardness around what they're doing, what do you think is a good coaching program? Because the one thing that I've certainly seen from people that I've interacted with, the ones that might be a little more socially awkward are usually really good at following either a process or they're really good at some avenue of the business that would make a great deal of sense, but just your interaction with that person reflects negative to them. So as a leader in the interview process, what do you need to see through in order to, remove that remove judgment of that away from the actual skill set that you're looking for?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's such a great point because you bring up some of the strengths that awkward people have. So, the awkward employee is going to add intellectual diversity to your organization. And so, for example, like you said, they're really good with processes and structures. So if there's certain things that you don't have that you need in place for processes and structures, they'll be great at identifying that. And they actually love building that stuff, which is a relief
Yeah.
for people who don't enjoy that. There's a tremendous persistence with socially awkward people. So they'll sit there and they'll work on the same boring task for days or weeks on end if they're interested in it. And God bless them. And
Yeah.
it oftentimes produces a product that's really high quality and really well thought through. So I think that intellectual diversity piece is one thing in the hiring process. I think the other thing would be for the social part of it. I guess I ask myself, is this person humble and open-minded? Number one, because if they are, then they have a pretty good handle on who they are and what their strengths and weaknesses are. Number two, does this person show a certain degree of mental strength, right? Or mental toughness? And if they do have those two things, the humility and the mental strength, I'm pretty much guaranteed that whatever feedback I give them, one, they're going to be coachable, but two, they're going to work really hard, right, to overcome that. And I'm pretty confident that they will. So if those two things are in place, I'd have a lot of faith this person will be just fine in a role.
And then the ongoing management of that person post that, what would you advise? Like, again, there's a lot of people at the moment. I know that some of the people that are listening don't have an office to go into or whatever it may be. And that's probably actually led very much into those that are a little bit more socially awkward applying more for the jobs that they can work from home. But if you've got an office and they're coming in or they're part of your team and the general interaction with everybody is not exactly what you want it to be, how would you coach them through that? Like, what are some of the things that you would do with them? Because I don't feel like bringing somebody into your office or having a conversation and go, hey, you are just hard to deal with from a socially awkward perspective.
Right.
That right there is not going to go well with that person.
Yeah.
It's not going to encourage them. It's denigrating them in a sense. What do you think is good coaching with them along the way?
Yeah, you're totally right about that. That's not going to go over well. I'm a big fan of having the values reflected in what's evaluated. And so if you need people to be socially fluent in certain situations and you need them to be good team players, the first thing I would say is that on the rubric for how they're evaluated in some kind of way or reflected in the values. Then I think what that does is it creates a certain amount of motivation if someone's not strongly motivated in the first place. But two, it opens up a really natural way then to say, hey, we're going to talk about this because it's something that we value here and it's important that this is done at a certain level. And so then when you bring in the person, let's say for a quarterly review or monthly meeting or whatever it is, I would say, hey, let's just have that as one of the things that we're going to talk about every time. And it's the same thing, though. Let's make it specific. Let's make it behavioral. So what kinds of things are you doing or not doing? And then let's have it be the kind of thing where you can get positive feedback about it when it's going well, but also get some gentle but honest feedback when there's deficiencies or they need to do better. So I think that takes a lot of the weirdness out of that feedback process is if it's just like, hey, we talk about this with everybody. And
Yep.
one of the things I'll say too, Ben, real quick, is that, I think this is valuable also, even if someone's a really sociable, socially fluent person, sometimes they might have some weird things about being
Mm.
gossipy or playing, political games or something like that. Having this as part of the rubric and as part of a regular conversation, then also allows you to have that conversation with everybody, and so then keep those dynamics going well. I would think you're doing a good job of that, because just based on what I saw at the conference and the hanging out with people there, I got such a good interpersonal vibe, and I did get this sense that there was some force, some value that was saying, "Hey, let's focus on getting along and supporting one another here."
Well, again, I think there's an element that you can lead that, and you can preach that. There is a part of it that is by default because of the quality of the people that you surround yourself with as well. So I think we do have a good quality core that we've had from the day one that certainly has helped that. So that's probably some learning in it as well. But
Yeah.
Ty, as we come to the sort of the conclusion of our podcast together, I think that this is a fascinating topic, and I love having people on the podcast that are external to the real estate industry and that can see across all industries. Your product base or your topic is such a widely spoken about something across all fields, really. So that said, is that in the midst of sort of just rounding out the episode, we usually ask our guests around podcast, books, and maybe a life hack or two that they might want to share with everybody. So let's start with podcasts. Or do you have time to do podcasts and books? Like, what are some of your favorite podcasts or books
Yeah.
that you listen to or read?
Yeah, sure. One podcast I listen to every week actually is Mark Maron's WTF podcast, which, having all kinds of different people, but I love when he has comedians on. Actually, I think comedy is just one of the harder art forms to master and go through. And I think there's very honest conversations there about, not only people's successes and whatever it is they're promoting at that time, but he kind of gets into, hey, what are the things that have humbled you? What are the things you're struggling with? And I think that's nice for any of us who can be in leadership positions sometimes, or feel like we have to be on and be at a certain level of competence, to hear that, wow, these people who I thought have no flaws have actually gone through long periods of struggle to get to where they're at. I think that's really valuable for me.
Yeah, great. And then favorite books that you might recommend to the audience?
Oh, yeah. So I guess one of the ones that has had the biggest impact on me over the past few years is Cal Newport's Deep Work. And Cal just does such a great job talking about not only the age of distraction that we live in, how we're pulled and fragmented in so many different ways, but he also gives some really concrete tips about, hey, how do we take the things that we do best and how we manage time, and how do we actually live a daily life that maximizes the things that we do best and that we actually want to contribute to the world.
Right.
And for me, especially in the age that we're living in, it just gave me some really great habits that I have to say, Ben, I practice every day ever since I've read it.
Can we lead that into maybe a life hack or two and round out the episode with maybe something out of the book, like a takeaway that you got from a daily habit that you would recommend to the audience?
Sure. So one of the biggest ones, I think one of the things people find most curious when they come to visit me here in New York, is from 7 to 10:30 every morning, if I can, 7 to 11. I go to the coffee shop. Get to order the same thing every day, sit in the same spot. It's a little weird, but and I get to just focus. There's no phone. It's on silent, the whole deal. I just get to focus on what's the most important piece of work I'm going to do that day that requires the most mental effort and focus. And those 3.5, 4 hours are the most important hours of my day, and they're totally protected. And so part of that has been conditioning the people in my life to say, hey, I'm just not available at that time. And people have respected that. And if they haven't, I guess that tells you something about the kind of friend they are or colleague they are. But that's been hugely productive. And I have to say, for me, it's been a game changer in what I've been able to accomplish.
Well, mate, we really appreciate you jumping on and sharing everything with us. Again, a fascinating topic that makes us think more deeply about what we do rather than just sell homes, because people is just a very big part of what we do. But again, appreciate you being so open, appreciate your efforts at the conference as well. And certainly you've affected a great deal of people in our community with the way that they think about things. And also, I think the way that they feel more comfortable about the situation that you talk about. Again, somebody confronting it and being as open about it as you, I think, is such a great thing, because you do feel lonely sometimes thinking, am I the only one? You do feel guilty thinking that I'm not going to that event because I don't want to network. But this does make you feel more part of a network, so to speak.
Yeah, so, totally. And I appreciate you having me on, and appreciate meeting everybody I was able to meet at the conference. And so I appreciate you all.
Thanks so much, Ty.
All right, thank you.
So about 75% of our audience hasn't liked, followed, or subscribed to our podcast. It would mean the world to us, and it would help this podcast more than you know to expand our reach if you were to like, follow, or subscribe on any of the platforms that you're watching or listening on. Thanks again.